Good afternoon, everyone. I am, as I told Julie earlier, I'm coming off the heels of a student's bat mitzvah this morning, so I'm sort of verklempt a little bit. Like I'm thinking about this very special student and her family, sort of sitting with me. So, like I'm so emotional just talking about it. So I'm sort of going to dedicate this learning to her and her learning journey, and may we all, of course, but this beautiful inside and out young lady, may she always continue to learn Jewishly and otherwise all things for the rest of her time. So I might say this a lot. I know I say this to some of my students. I sometimes say we really have our work cut out for us today. We have a lot of work ahead of us. And I feel like that today about Tamar. So we'll dive in. I'll give you a little bit of background. And as Julie knows, I often tend to add to my material if I can before we meet together. So I do have quite a bit of new material for all of us to look at together today. And especially with this chapter, I actually wrote, I almost forgot, I don't know how I forgot, but I actually wrote a paper on this chapter in Genesis in graduate school. And I remember loving the process. And I actually, when the title of today came to me, I realized that it was the same title of my paper many years ago. So I guess what I thought was very challenging today is that, if everyone could mute, that would be great. Somebody's unmuted, I think. Thank you. What was I gonna say? Did
your voice go off?
Oh.
Did your voice go off?
No, I'm still talking.
Oh, mine's still off.
Okay. I think I'm muting someone who's unmuted. So I think the challenge today is, at least for me, it was almost looking at Tamar and her character in new ways. And, you know, I'm assuming there's a range of knowledge about Tamar here. So for you, it might be looking at her anew, like me, or just looking at her and her character from scratch. So let me dive in a little bit to the context. I think it's important to set the context for where this story is in the book of Genesis. So I'm going to share my screen. I think this is my screen. That's not the screen that I need to share. Okay, so we're going to get to that later. Okay, so also I'll just say to begin with that this is the title of the class today. Is Genesis 38 the story of Tamar, or is it the story of Judah? So you might be saying, well, who's Judah? So I will tell you who Judah is. Oops, I stopped the share. Let me do that again. And I always mention at the beginning that, first of all, I don't see the chat box while I'm sharing ideas with you. So you're welcome to email me if you don't get to share an idea when I pause for questions or reflections. Oops. I always have screen issues. Sorry, I can't find my correct screen. I closed it by accident. Sorry. Oh no, here it is. Okay, so so my email, which I'll put in the chat box later, but in case you want to write it down now, is abby@explorejewish.com, and I hope to hear from you. So hold on. Okay, so what I want to point out to begin with right now is that this is just a very brief outline, and then we'll scroll below also, but don't be too distracted by the table below. This is a very brief outline of where are we in Genesis. And this is the language of a chosen figure is from the translation of Everett Fox, who's just a beyond wonderful translator and biblical scholar. And so these are the chapters on Abraham. These are the chapters on Jacob. Isaac isn't exactly a chosen figure in the same way that the other forefathers are. So we're in the middle of Yosef. And you can see, actually, we're not even in the middle. We're really only at Genesis 38. So what happens in Genesis 37? So I'm just going to scroll down so you can have this handy. So you likely know the story of Joseph and his dreams and his boasting about his really seeing himself as the brother that all his other brothers, Jacob's sons, he saw Jacob and his mother Rachel and all his other brothers is worshiping him, bowing down to him, and eventually the brothers decide to try and get rid of him. They've had enough. They're perhaps jealous of him, but they're frustrated with his taunting and his arrogance. And you see that I noted here that Reuben, who's the oldest, wants to throw Joseph into the pit rather than like they're causing Joseph to die. Judah actually makes a couple of suggestions, and it's his suggestions that win over. Judah is the fourth son of Jacob. And as you know, our name or the name of the Jewish people comes from Judah, from the southern kingdom that outlasted the northern kingdom of Israel. And much of the Bible actually looks back, is really a look back on the period, on ancient Israel. And sometimes you can actually read into the text, you can see that there's these, that the southern perspective, the Judean perspective is actually the one that wins out. And Judah, the fourth brother, ends up trumping the other brothers for the role of leader. So, and in chapter 37, that seems to begin a little bit. His suggestion about what to do with Joseph wins out more than the actual oldest. And throughout the whole Bible, there's this reversal of primogeniture, of the oldest, typically in the ancient Near East, is the inheritor, is the special one. And Israel, the people of Israel, the Israelites saw themselves as the younger of the nations, the weaker of the nations, and they saw themselves as special in relation to God. And that's reflected in some of the stories. So again, just to sum up, and then I'm going to pause to see if people need to clarify. Judah is the fourth of the sons of Jacob. And in chapter 37, right before we get to chapter 38, it's his suggestion about what to do with Joseph that wins out. And in the end, it's the Judean kingdom, not Joseph's sons and the rest of the tribes in their kingdom. It's the Judean kingdom that lasts for longer, and that in effect we stem from. So so that's the context, sort of a historical and a Genesis context of the story that is important. I know there was a lot of detail, so I am going to stop here for a moment and just check in. And please, if something was not clear and you need some elaboration or clarification, I will really encourage a couple of questions at this point so we can start off clearly. So I'll pause and, oh, Julie,
you can put those in the chat box, or you can use the raise hand function. There's too many people to see it by waving.
Okay, thanks, Julie. Okay, I don't see any questions. So let me continue, and certainly I'll pause again for questions. So I'm going to reshare. Okay, so what we're going to do now, I will mention briefly before we read some of the verses, is that there are a lot of place names, a lot of towns mentioned in this chapter. I really, honestly, I could not find a map that had them all, but just so that you're somewhat familiar with, just to remind everybody of what we're talking about. This is one of the, sometimes the maps, particularly of ancient Israel, show the highlands where the mountains are, where Jerusalem is over here, and then the flatlands that get flatter as we go east. So one of the places that will be mentioned today is Adullam, and yeah, it's Adullam, and every city that's mentioned today is in Judea in the south. So there is an emphasis today cities or towns, places in the South. So these are just to give you a quick glance. These are just some names of the places that will be mentioned. Okay. Let me just see here if there's anything else that I really wanted to mention right away. No, I don't think so. Oh, I will actually mention one more thing, which for those of you who were with me in the session on the Book of Ruth, we talked about the ancient institution, not just an Israelite institution, of Yibum, or Levirate marriage. And that institution is at the core of our story today. So we'll see how the characters fit into that story. But just to sum up what you see here, if there was a man and a woman, a couple, and the man dies and they don't have children, it is the obligation of the brother-in-law to marry the woman in order to perpetuate the name of the dead brother. And today we'll see that actually the obligation seems to have fallen on the father-in-law, and scholars believe that our version of Yibum today in Genesis 38 is actually an earlier version than the one described in Deuteronomy. And in fact, Deuteronomy is a later book than Genesis, so that makes sense. So those are the verses about Yibum. And just again, before we dive into the verses, these are the questions that I want us to think about today. Is this the story of Tamar, or is it the story of Judah? And last week, you may remember somebody said, well, why is it one or both? So it's a question that I've written in a somewhat of a provocative way, and maybe it is both. What are each character's bold and courageous or ethical or leadership-like actions? Whose actions should we consider more bold or courageous? And what is the message about each character and his or her development, his character or her character development in the story? So I'll come back to those. Okay, so I will ask for a reader for the first part of the Judah Tamar story. We're going to try and get through a lot of text today. I really hope we do. So would anyone like to volunteer to be our reader number 1 for the first part of Genesis 38? I can't see. Is that, I think Ellen might be raising her hand. Ellen, can you give a thumbs up if you're raising your hand? Okay, great.
Is that Ellen Edelman or Ellen's iPad?
Ellen's iPad.
Go ahead, you can unmute yourself, Ellen.
About that time, Judah left his brothers and camped near a certain Adulamite, whose name was Hira. There Judah saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite, whose name was Shura, and he married her and cohabitated with her. She conceived and bore a son, and he named her She conceived another and bore a son and named him Onan. Once again, she bore a son and named him Shelah. He was a
Chaziv, yeah.
Shabbat when she bore him. Judah got a wife for his firstborn. Her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was displeasingly evil to the Lord, and the Lord took his life.
Oh, go ahead. Keep going.
Then Judah said to Onan, join with your brother's wife and do your duty by her as a brother-in-law and provide offspring for your brother. But Onan knew that the seed would not count as his. Let it go to waste whenever he joined with his brother's wife, so as not to provide offspring for his brother. What he did was displeasing the Lord, and he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law, Tamar, stay as a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up. For he thought, he too might die like his brothers. So Tamar went to live in her father's house.
Okay, thank you very much, Owen. I know there's some hard names in there, so thank you. Okay, so Judah left his brothers. So the Joseph saga, and I'm going to stop sharing for a second, just to sum up for everyone. So Judah leaves his brothers. So notice he's leaving his brothers to some degree in the midst of a crisis, right? Joseph is like, they faked Joseph's death to the father. They don't know for sure that he's died. They bring Joseph's special coat that Jacob created for him, and they're like, Dad, we think he died. And meanwhile, they sold him to slavery to Egypt, to the Midianites. And then he leaves, like out of nowhere. Judah leaves his brothers, and also, furthermore, although at this point in the writing of the Torah, it's not clear that marrying a Canaanite was such a terrible thing. I can't imagine that it was still the most favorable thing, even though if you marry a Canaanite woman, she just becomes part of your Israelite clan, no problem. Different, very different than the way many people think about intermarriage today. And so he leaves his family, he marries a foreigner, they have kids, he and his wife, who's not named, Bat Shua, the daughter of Shua. Oops, I'm sorry. Oh, I forgot you can't see my screen for a second, but hopefully you have it in front of you. He marries the daughter of Shua, not named. They have kids. And then God does not think those young men, those boys are good, and they're called Ra, evil. And the firstborn, marries Tamar, and we don't know very much about Tamar, but we do know her name means date palm or palm tree, and there are multiple Tamars in the Torah. And Judah, in the end, does something again that's of questionable ethics, and I'm being a little polite here. It's not so questionable. He says to Tamar, "Listen, go back to your father's house. Let's wait till Shelah grows up," which could be true, but the reader is supposed to infer that Judah has no intention at all of marrying Tamar to the third son, because he doesn't want his third son to die. Understandably so, of course, obviously goes without saying, but he's not clued in. Judah is not clued in at all to a bigger picture here, right? He's not, he leaves his Israelite brothers mostly, and then he goes off on this journey and doesn't behave ethically in a variety of ways. So that's all we know so far. And it does seem like the obligation for levirate marriage was on him, and he did not fulfill that obligation. Okay, so let's read. I will share my screen again, and I'd like us to read what I called part 2 of this story. So let me just share my screen again, and I will ask for another reader for part 2. Oops, sorry, that's my screen. It's my desktop. Okay, so may I ask for a reader for part 2?
Great, Sharon.
Thank you, Sharon. Hi, thank you so much.
So do you want me to start with 12?
Verse 12, exactly. Thank you.
A long time afterward, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, died. When his period of mourning was over, Judah went up to Timnah to his sheep shearers, together with his friend Hira the Adulamite. And Tamar was told, "Your father-in-law is coming up to Timnah for the sheep shearing." So she took off her widow's garb, covered her face with a veil, and, wrapping herself up, sat down at the entrance to Enam, which is on the road to Timnah. And she saw that Shelah was grown up, yet she had not been given to him as wife. When Judah saw her, he took her for a prostitute, for she had covered her face. So he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here, let me sleep with you," for he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. "What," she asked, "will you pay for sleeping with me?" He replied, "I will send a kid from my flock." But she said, "You must leave a pledge until you have sent it." And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She replied, your seal and cord and the staff which you carry. So he gave them to her and slept with her, and she conceived by him.
Okay, thank you, Sharon. So I want to invite, before I share some thoughts, I want to invite one or two comments on both the character development of Judah so far and his ethics, and also the character development of Tamar and perhaps her ethics also. So two questions in one. Feel free to comment on either. Judah's ethics and Tamar's ethics in the context of their character development. So would anyone like to?
Elizabeth? I don't know if your hand was raised to volunteer to read, or. We can't hear you, Elizabeth.
Okay, so maybe we'll move on to another comment.
Yeah, there's some in the chat, Abby, that I can read.
Okay, sure.
So did she try to trick him? Is a question. Carol says, Tamar has become wiser and now has a plan. Robin says, you have to wonder why Judah is so quickly taking a prostitute. And Susan says, Tamar seems to be desperate to have a child.
Okay, great. So a lot of food for thought here. Thank you to everybody for those comments. I actually can't see them for some reason. So thank you, Julie, for reading those. Okay, so hopefully I can remember all of those. So let's just note, I'm actually literally noting with a pen, that Tamar does seem to be desperate to have a child, but we're going to talk about why that is. And indeed, I think Robin, if I'm not mistaken, said that Judah, like, why is he going to a prostitute? That's also of questionable ethics. And there's one more comment that I apologize, I cannot remember at the moment. So if you want to unmute yourself and jump in and say what that was, you're welcome to do that. I'm gonna share my thoughts. So Tamar is desperate to have a child. It's true. But what I would suggest here is that this is really a story. This, as I mentioned, the story begins, and I'll share, let me just share a different document. So just so that you can see the columns, this is the column here is about Judah, and this column here is about Tamar. And the story begins, again, with Judah, who has questionable ethics, and Tamar's not really, she has no voice, she's not taking any action. That was the other comment, that she was, that she seemed to have a plan. Maybe it was Robin who said that, actually. But now, in the middle of this chapter, something seems to shift. Judah does go, actually, now that I think about it, I might take back a little bit of what I said, but Judah is still behaving unquestionable and with questionable ethics. And one thing that I want to point out is that this is sheep shearing season. It's considered a joyous celebratory time. And his wife has died, he mourns, and then he goes to celebrate. So there's like a quick shift there, it sounds like. It seems like the author wants us to think, like there's a very quick shift happening. And then he sees a prostitute and takes her up on her offer very quickly. Meanwhile, so there's really no strong ethical basis for his behavior at all. But Tamar, and again, I'm going to sort of point out, I'm going to skip a little bit and point out what ends up happening after this story, and we'll definitely fill in the rest of Genesis 38. But as soon as this story ends, it is Judah who really takes on the role as the leader of the brothers. He's the one who convinces his father Jacob to let Benjamin go back to Egypt with the brothers, as Joseph had demanded, Joseph in disguise had demanded, so that the brothers can get food for their family during the famine. It's Judah who does that, who convinces his dad to make the break and separate from his son that he loves, his second favorite son, Rachel's second child, after Joseph, and he assumes Joseph is dead. And then in the negotiations with Joseph, he tries to get Joseph to understand that their father loves this kid, Benjamin, and he already lost another kid. And that's when he gets Joseph to break down and come clean with who he actually is. So Judah, this story seems to be telling us that Judah's on a character development journey. And he's really, he's in the, and we'll see exactly how that happens, but this is really, in Genesis, a story about Judah. So the comment about the desperation to have a child is right on, because what's happening, and what happens through all of Genesis, is that the threat of the of our ancestors not being able to perpetuate themselves happens all the time. There are barren women. Here, Judah's sons are being killed, and there's no heir to Judah. And that's considered, for the reader at the time, is probably hearing the story either, probably hearing the story quite a few years after it's written. So they're already either a Jewish person or a Judean person who's hearing the story and saying, oh my God, it almost happened that my ancestors didn't make it. It almost happened because Judah he didn't really know how to behave so ethically. He didn't fulfill the obligation of Yibum. But how did the lineage get perpetuated? Through Tamar. Because she knew, and right, this happens with Rivka, with Rebecca also, she knows from God that she's supposed to perpetuate the lineage, not with Esav, but with Jacob. And this also, there are echoes of the Ruth story in here also. Ruth also, she sort of intuits that we can, this is a little different than a little bit of a different suggestion that I offered in the Ruth sessions, but she intuits that she should be perpetuating a family line, perhaps. It's a little bit of an interpretation, but it's the woman often who intuits that action has to be taken in the face of a man who doesn't really know what's going on. So let me pause there to address where we are in the story and my suggestion that this is, so far, it really seems to be a story in Genesis about Judah's character development rather than necessarily Tamar's. But Tamar does know that there's something ethical, there's a right thing is supposed to happen. So let me pause there for any clarification, questions, or reflections.
Yeah, so there's a few in the comment box, and I think a couple people have their hands raised as well.
Okay, so I'll take one or two.
So first, Elizabeth, who was having unmuting trouble, put her comment in the box. I think Tamar was courageous in trying to take control of her future, especially as a woman in those times. And then there was a clarifying question, what you meant by Judea being the weaker area of Israel. Do you mean militarist?
Okay, thank you. So, okay, I don't know exactly what I said, but let me definitely clarify. Okay, so historically, what we know about Judea is that it was a small southern kingdom that was weaker than the northern kingdom of Israel. Nevertheless, the northern kingdom of Israel died out. It was destroyed by the Assyrian Empire about 150 years before the destruction of the second temple in Jerusalem, in Judea. And in the end, even though the northern kingdom was originally stronger, Judea was stronger in perpetuity. Judea not only lasted longer in the first temple period, but it was rebuilt through Ezra and Nehemiah and through Jewish life that lasted in and around Jerusalem until the destruction of the second temple in 70 of the Common Era. So much of the Bible, and this is a perfect example, if you think about this, what we're really looking at here is the rise of Judah as a leader and as our ancestor. and even though Joseph was the favored son, Joseph and his sons Ephraim and Manasseh were considered northern tribes, and the northerners were considered idol worshippers more so than the southern kingdom. Not completely. The southerners did also behave badly according to our texts, but it's the southern kingdom that was militaristically weaker initially, but it lasted longer. And it also lasted, it reinvigorated itself in the Second Temple period. And this story, one could think of all of Genesis, where we can see Judah's character development as our ancestors looking back on their ancestors saying, oh, this is the story of how Judah begins to trump Joseph. Judah not only trumps the firstborn Reuben, he also trumps Joseph, the favored child. So I hope that clarifies a little bit. Okay, so actually I'm going to move on to the last part of the story to think about how these characters end up at the end of the story, Tamar and Judah. And I hope we'll have a little bit of time for some commentaries and to talk about the messages of leadership and ethics here. Okay, so I would love for someone to read part 3, the end of our chapter. So another wonderful volunteer.
Anshia?
Hi, it's actually Inshia.
Anshia, sorry.
Hi, Anshia. Let me share my screen. Thank you for volunteering.
Okay.
Is there a way to make the text a little bigger?
Thank you, Julie. Yes.
Thank you.
Better?
Great.
Actually, I clicked on the link, so I'm reading it from.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead.
So let's see.
So this is after, if you don't, let me just say, this is after Judah pledges these identifying markers, like a driver's license type thing, to Tamar, and as collateral before he can actually pay her with a sheep or with whatever. Okay,
So
thank you.
We're at part 3, right?
Part 3, thank you so
Okay.
much.
All right. Then she went on her way. She took off her veil and again put on her widow's garb. Judah sent the kid by his friend the Adulamite to redeem the pledge from the woman, but he could not find her. He inquired of the people of that town, "Where is the cult prostitute, the one at Enaim, by the road?" But they said, "There has been no prostitute here." So he returned to Judah and said, "I could not find her." Moreover, the townspeople said, "There has been no prostitute here." Judah said, "Let her keep them, lest we become a laughing stock. I did send her this kid, but you did not find her." About 3 months later, Judah was told, "Your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot. In fact, she is with child by harlotry. Bring her out," said Judah, "and let her be burned." As she was being brought out, she sent this message to her father-in-law: "I am with child by the man to whom these belong." And she added, "Examine these. Whose seal and cord and staff are these?" Judah recognized them and said, "She is more in the right than I am. Sadka
Sadka mimeni, she is more righteous than me.
mimeni. As in, or in as much as I did not give her my son Shelah. And he was not intimate with her again. When the time came for her to give birth, there were twins in her womb. While she was in labor, one of them put out his hand, and the midwife tied a crimson thread on that hand to signify, "This one came out first." But just then he drew back his hand and came out his brother, and she said, "What a breach you have made for yourself." So he was named Perez. Afterward, his brother came out.
That's okay.
Afterward, his brother came out, on whose hand was a crimson thread. He was named Zerah.
Okay, thank you. That's a little bit of a confusing ending, but basically there's a reversal of older and younger. The kid who's supposed to be older actually goes back through the birth canal, and the kid who's younger comes out as the new oldest. So again, there's this theme the person who's supposed to be older, and the one with the higher status is actually not. So I want to go back up a little bit, and I'm going to keep my screen shared for the moment, talk a little bit about how the story resolves itself, and then I hope we'll get to look at a rabbinic commentary or two. So actually, let me invite out another, I wonder what you think, what any of you think of Tamar's character development here and her role in connection to ethical behavior, and also Judah's character development. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'll take two comments in relation to specifically to character development.
Ellen Edelman has her hand up, though I think it was up already, so I'm not sure. Ellen, did you have a response to this question?
Well, my comment is I think Tamar is showing agency in terms of Yibum, because she knows that she was supposed to be Sheila's wife, and she's trying to resolve that issue. So if she couldn't be the third son's wife, she was going to, one way or another,
right,
see that Judah's line is carried on, whether it was the third son or Judah himself. She was going to make sure that there was a son to that line. She
right.
recognized the law and was going to make sure the law was there.
Right, that's true, absolutely. And what about my curiosity at this moment is, what about the end of that story in Tamar? It's true, I fully agree with you. She really takes matters into her own hands. She knows that there's supposed to be an heir to Judah, and she wants to make that happen. But what about her behavior at the end, and Judah's behavior at the very end also?
I'm intrigued that she did it privately.
Okay.
That was key, that she did not do it publicly and embarrass Judah. She did it privately. So his dignity was upheld, and which is also a really key point, that she did not embarrass him in public, that he could hold his head up high. Nobody knew that, he could say it if he wanted to in public, but his pride was upheld.
Right. Okay. Thank you, Ellen. I want to invite, if there was I think there were a couple of other voices that wanted to be heard here. So I wanted to invite one other reflection on either of their character developments, and then I'll try and wrap it all up.
Andrea or Andrea?
Oh, hi, it's Andrea.
Hi.
Yeah, so personally, I get bored by talking about male leadership in Genesis. I mean, that's just me, but I think Genesis is such a fertile ground for looking at women in the Torah, and I really prefer to focus on the women. So that's just my view. So just this theme of like deception, women's deception really interests me as a literary trope. And so, Lot's daughters, they deceive him into procreating. Rachel and Leah, they have that family, they have their deception going on. And Tamar she just falls in with these great Jewish heroines, in Genesis, and using deception and sexuality, deceptive sexuality, because that is the only tool that they have.
Okay, true
enough.
They
don't have, they can't get justice. They have to use their sexuality. Like, that is their position in that society, and they do it very well. And I just love the delicious recognition and reversal, with Judah. And it's like, I'm a classics scholar and professor, so it's almost like it's comic in a way to me.
Yes.
So that's how I'm reading it.
Yes. Okay. Thank you so much for that. And thank you for bringing your own literary background into our conversation. It really enriches our conversation. So thank you for that. As we near toward our end today, I really appreciated the comments and do want to bring them to a close and offer you the following, which is that Judah does seem to go through an ethical transformation in this chapter. And he says some of, I feel like I've read this somewhere, but to me, these are some of the most powerful words in the whole Torah. And I remember I said that about Ruth also, about wherever you go, I will go. So I'm adding these to some of the most powerful words. You are more righteous than me. I made a mistake. I messed up. And there are some commentaries that talk about how the word Yehudah, his name in Hebrew, it also means to acknowledge. It also means gratitude. So even in his name, which the rabbis also say in Yehudah's name, there are the 4 letters of the tetragrammaton of God's name in Yud He Vav He in Hebrew. And the rabbis say these are, he deserved that name because of admitting how wrong he was. Now, Ellen mentioned how Tamar actually managed, and it's true, I love that Andrea, forgive me, you can tell me after, brought in this idea of deception. And there's a lot in this story about seeing and not seeing. And in the end, Judah is able to see, he's able to acknowledge. Tamar tells him he made errors, he made such grave errors, but she does in fact do so in ways that, and I'll say this and certainly open to feedback, are humble and modest. And she, you know, oftentimes I think when we tell people that they did something wrong, I mean, for myself, certainly, sometimes I don't do it in a way that allows the other person to actually hear it. She actually, I think, models for us taking matters into her own hands, courage and bravery and independence in a time, as many of you said, where that wasn't necessarily allotted to her. And she, you know, intuits that there is a lineage that needs to continue, and she makes that happen through disguise and through a way that allows the other person to come clean and that allows Judah to transform himself. Okay, I'm just looking at the time. Julie, do I have another minute or two, or do I need to really?
Yes, we have
Another
minute
minute or
5
two?
minutes or so.
Okay, great, perfect. So what I want to just point out to you briefly is a couple of rabbinic commentaries so you can see what the rabbis do with her character. They notice, Rashbam, a medieval Jewish biblical commentator, notices that as she was being brought out to apparently be killed because she was an adulteress, which actually is not even the punishment for, well, I won't even get into that now because I don't even want to speak, but that's a questionable punishment. There are other, lashes actually is the other punishment in the Bible. So she didn't want to reveal to Yehudah, sorry, who she didn't want to reveal publicly that Judah was the one who got her pregnant. And Rashi says that she sent a message because she didn't want to shame him. And she even said, let them burn me, but I don't want to shame him. So obviously that's extreme, and from a feminist perspective, and I'm certainly sensitive to that, it sounds like it's a little, it might make your skin cringe, it might make you cringe a little bit, but the truth is, I think both of them go through these character developments, and I would say in the most honest way I can that even though in the end, I think this is a story about Judah, and I'll say, that is what Genesis, much of Genesis, it does center on men. Nevertheless, I think that Tamar is just an incredible role model for courage and actions that are simultaneously courageous and humble, and that, similar to one of the commentaries we read on Devorah, she's able to, we were told about Devorah that she could communicate in a way, she could rebuke people in a way that got them to do the right thing. And so, you know, from both of those characters, from Devorah and from Tamar, I think we can glean these characters who can serve to strengthen women and any gender, that acting in humble ways and in ways that, communicating in ways that people can hear for the purpose of a larger picture of justice, or, you know, in the case of Genesis, a lineage that's supposed to continue. These are women that are models for all that courage and all that positive communication. So I hope you'll join me next week also to see how Miriam might change or strengthen our picture of strong, courageous, biblical women who we can learn from.